Hello and Assalamu alaikum. I am Parvez Khan. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Kohat University of Science and Technology. The subject is National and International Affairs. The course code is JMC 341. It's our lecture number 14, which is Pakistan India relations. So today we'll be talking about Pakistan-India relations in historical context, also in the current context, how relationship has evolved over the years. We'll be discussing this in detail. So before starting our session, we'll be talking about the objectives of this class. What are the objectives of this session today? The first objective is that students will be able to understand Pakistan's relationship with India in historical context. Students will be able to develop a geostrategic understanding of Pakistan's relation with its neighboring India and discussing war's history and the future that lies ahead with India, particularly when geopolitical context is changing every time. So this is what we'll be talking about in our today's session. So you can look at the map. We have a long eastern border with India. That's with long historical ties. There's a big history behind these both countries. How the relationship evolved, we'll be talking about it. But it's important to understand the historical context as well and the post-independence relations as well. But we'll be talking more about the post-independence relations because we already know about. We've already discussed in the past how the relationship went, what led to the separation or the division of the United India. But let's talk about the post independence relations. It's important to understand that Pakistan and India had strained relationship from the beginning. I mean, it's equally understandable that both these countries gained independence from the British Empire. The common colonial power was the British Empire, which was ruling the Indian subcontinent. It was not just that it happened in vacuum and the two countries were separated. Obviously, a lot of divisions were created. The ideological mindset was there. Then it became a problem. Two nation theory came into play. There was language issues. There were ethnic issues. There were religion came into play. So all these factors came in. But the major strong point is that both these countries, despite gaining independence from the British Empire in 1947, had strained relationship because of their ideological difference, political differences as well. And partition caused one of the biggest migration, causing riots and violence in the beginning. There was a lot of violence and large migration took place. Large number of people were killed on both sides of the border because the Muslims were making their way towards the Pakistan, while the Hindus that were already living here or the other minorities they were migrating. Even some Muslim families migrated to India, and some of the Hindu families decided to stay in Pakistan. That's what was happening. But obviously, since this was considered a Muslim land, so Muslims from all over India they migrated towards Pakistan to violent. The historical there's a lot of history to that as well. But initially, both countries were setting their tone for the economy, and despite early struggle in 1947 and 48, the relationship soured because of the issue of Kashmir. And the Pakistan and India, the first war over Kashmir is fought, and the armed tribesmen from Pakistan, which was called as Northwestern Frontier Province, now called Pakhtunkhwa, it invaded the disputed territory in 1947. A lot of people participated. It was like a war that took the first one. That's the first time that the relationship was sought between the two countries. And since then, we have the issue of Kashmir that we call it on our side. We call it both sides call the occupied Kashmir of both countries when they discuss it. So it's still a dispute between the two countries. But the war ended in 1949 when UN intervened and asked for ceasefire from both sides. They recommended referendum, but which is yet to be held so far. So yes, despite the number of years gone by, we've seen that despite 6, 7 decades, the issue is still pending. And even right now, even in the current context, the hot debate between the two countries is Kashmir, especially after how they were planning to have it in the recent circumstances. So it's important to talk about the slides and and Kashmir became the center of attention for both countries, prompting wars, disagreements, and hostility. And another element is that Pakistan declared itself as an Islamic Republic, a Muslim majority state, while India remained secular in its initial days, particularly. Now it's changing. Now the face of the Indian politics is also changing because the Congress, the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, it's a different story now. But both countries refer to the opposite sides of ceasefire line as occupied territory. As I just said, that there's a little recognition, and both countries have the part of Kashmir with them, and both countries call it occupied territory, and that's still a dispute. And we call it Azad Kashmir, and then we call the Indian one as occupied Kashmir, and similarly the Indians do the same. And this is partly because there's a big issue pending, and there's still referendum needs to be done, and all these issues are still pending, and that's why recently as well we've seen that a lot of stance has been taken on Kashmir issue. But going back to historical context, following the 1963 war, India and China war, Swaran Singh and Bhutto, the two world leaders, tried to negotiate, but they failed again. And, and then we must also realize that Pakistan and India are both nuclear armed countries, and that the relationship between them is often sensitive. And after 1948-49, what happened in initially 47-48, the Kashmir occupation, and how these territories were invaded by the local tribesmen. The three wars were also there to talk about, particularly the 1965 war between Pakistan and India, the 1971 war, and then obviously the 1999, the infamous Kargil war that took place between. These were the three major wars after the initial days, the wars that took place, and that's when relationship and diplomatic ties were cut off. It was a serious war situation, and then the superpowers had to intervene because they all knew that now these countries are nuclear armed countries, and they wanted them to settle down their differences. Going back to history again, talking about 1972, there's a lot of history. Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi signed an agreement in the town of Simla, in which both countries agreed to put an end to the conflict and confrontation that have marred the relationships, and they tried to work for the promotion of a friendly and harmonious relationship. But Pakistan and India have negotiated various issues between 1984 and 1997 as well. Between 1984 and 1997, several issues which include the Siachen, Sir Creek, and Bulbul or Ular, and with little achievement. They debated, prepared contracts. Final approval of the management was given, but the approval of management was lacking due to these years of mistrust, hate, and hostility between the two nations. So it didn't work out. There were various things were sorted out. Discussions were there. Even the drafting of several contracts were there, but it didn't work out well. And that's why the relationship has always been strained with India. And then there is other issues that Pakistan, if you look at the current context, particularly after the Afghan war that took place, Pakistan have accused India of their covert presence in Afghanistan through their increasing number of consulates. Pakistan accused India over their involvement in Balochistan and aiding militancy in Pakistan. That's another, because Pakistan believes that there's an Indian influence in Balochistan, or the insurgencies that are taking place in the militancy. This is what some statements came also forward, and this is what normally keeps coming. Both sides keep accusing each other. And India accused Pakistan of their cross-border infiltration in Kashmir through Mujahideen and through all this. So yes, there are issues that concerns mistrust when it comes to diplomatic ties between the two countries. And it's also important to look at these issues in the present context as well. How important it is to look into the present context, because when we look at it, the relationships have been strained between the two countries in the last 2 decades. There have been events and incidents that have provoked a cut-off from diplomatic ties. That's some serious issues that happened between the two both countries. The relationship have majorly been strained in the 2 decades. And what we can think about is that most recently, if you go to the current context, uh, India recently conducted an aerial strike in what they considered a banned outfit They targeted the band outfit, and which caused serious diplomatic crisis between the two countries. And obviously, Pakistan also retaliated. And it is said that it happened right during the election days, prompting suspicions that this was just a publicity stunt for the re-elections in India, and it just affected the relationship between the two countries. Diplomatic ties were cut off. There were talks about the war on the two sides. Both countries, nuclear armed countries, coming and discussing and conducting aerial strikes. That's a serious thing that happened in the recent past. But then obviously, Pakistan returned their captured pilot in a bid to improve bilateral ties, and slowly and gradually things de-escalated. And obviously, there was a lot of praise for that, how Pakistan handled the situation by not retaliating harshly. That's another point that we need to talk about. And a new angle has recently developed of the China, because we have seen that more currently there's an issue between India and China on the border dispute issue in Ladakh, and since Sino-Indian border dispute is an ongoing territorial dispute over the sovereignty of two large and several smaller separated pieces of territory between China and India. So it's a serious issue that's happening. And since Pakistan is one of the strongest allies of China, Pakistan has taken a strong stance with China. Therefore, the relationship with India has been strained again, because Pakistan and China, Pakistan has a clear stance no matter how far it goes. But there's a context to that as well, with recently the investment, the seat packs, and all these things. But it's important to understand that Pakistan lies at the intersection of big powers, rivalry, and politics. This is a very important statement, and which is why Pakistan needs to look at its neighbors and the relationships with them. So we talk about another one, which is now China and Pakistan. China-Pakistan economic corridor. We have had a detailed session on it. You have already know about it. It's a multi-million-dollar project that serves as a flagship of Pakistan's China's and Belt Road Initiative, $62 billion. And obviously, with Pakistan, China is looking to expand on the relationship. And this is where the Indians will be having a keen eye. It will look for strategic partners. Obviously, Pakistan and China are getting closer, and China and India have economic rivalry. So obviously, there will be new political games. There will be new strategic points that we'll need to look into, and obviously, geopolitical circumstances will definitely change along with that. And similarly, with Saudi-Iran conflict and Pakistan still towards Turkey, the diplomatic statuses are changing, and this is where Pakistan reliance on China is even much more stronger. Pakistan had a strong reliance with Saudi relationship, but more recently Pakistan has acknowledged Turkey, and that's the geopolitical political circumstances are changing, which is a big shift in Pakistan's policy. And that's why more recently we've seen statements from Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, who openly criticized the countries who are not getting engaged in the Kashmir issue. And for that, Saudi reaction has also come forward, and we can see that by asking the repayments of loans, and obviously the contracts related to oil, that has raised serious concerns in Pakistani circle. And that's why some efforts were also put down when Army Chief went to Saudi Arabia to re-establish the cordial relationship between the two countries. But that is an indication that yes, two countries, Pakistan's geopolitical dealings are changing, the circumstances are changing, and obviously this is what the international politics are all about. It's about allies, it's about new relations, it's about new opportunities. But despite that, Pakistan's relation with China will remain stronger, and which is why it will be a point of concern between the relationship of India and Pakistan in the future as well. Then it's better. We already know the circumstances are serious between India and Pakistan. We know that diplomatic relationships have been strained. We know that there have been not much economic development between the two countries since they have been at rivalry for a number of decades. But despite that, trade's happening between India and Pakistan. Although the volume of the trade is questionable, it can improve. According to Economic Times of India, in the first quarter of financial year 20, Indian exports to Pakistan were 452 million, and imports were just around 7 million. And you can see that in financial year 19, well, obviously there was much more trade. The total exports to Pakistan were 2.6 billion, and the imports were 495 million. That shows the volume of trade that we've had, because obviously there's a lot of trade going on between India and Pakistan, and the Wagah border is one of the major borders where the trade openly takes place. Despite even the crucial circumstances, trade kept happening, especially the exports of vegetables and goods and spices. That's always there. So trade is happening, which also gives a boost to local economy on both sides of the border, and that's important point of concern between the two countries. India-Pakistan trade has a lot of potential to increase from $2 billion to $37 billion if both countries are willing to take steps towards removing tariffs, and if they can support each other at the international level, it can improve the situation a lot better. And similarly, there are a lot of obstacles, and obviously we have talked about these obstacles. These obstacles are that both sides, the trade consider both tariff and non-tariff barriers, including, but not limited to, quality standards, sensitive list, goods on which no tariff concessions are granted. Then there are lengthy procedures and waiting periods at the border, and then there are strict visa policies. That is a very, very big hurdle, particularly the visa policies and the lengthy procedures where trucks keep waiting at the borders. And then we have the lack of proper infrastructure such as roads and dry ports and rail cargoes and stations to facilitate trade. So these factors combined, and these factors combined increase both the absolute and relative cost of the trade. And yes, obviously, if the cost of the trade increases due to security reasons, visa reasons, diplomatic hurdles are there, then obviously it's going to be costly, and then it's not going to be as effective as it should be. So both countries need to discuss the term about the free trade as it's happening in the Europe. They have opened their borders. There's free trade going on. The European Union was a very strong union which benefited from this. So there's a lot of issues that we can look into in terms of economy, because the major issue that concerns Pakistan and India is basically economy. Both countries need that. Both countries have strong reliance on these issues, and they need to look into it, because poverty is a concern which both countries need to address in the coming future. So, looking at the key points for future, will both countries look forward to address their economic issues? We just discussed the major issue, the most important issue between the two countries, economics. They have to look into it, they have to talk about it. And then, will Kashmir issue ever be solved? Do you think Kashmir issue can be solved? Will both countries reduce their defense budgets and focus on trade and development? Is that possible? Because that's another issue, because there's a lot of escalation in Kashmir and the border issues, and both countries need to look into it, because that's also putting a lot of burden on the economy as well. And how will India respond to changing geopolitical circumstances, particularly when there's China involved with Pakistan? So that's a point that we need to look for future as well. So these are some of the interesting things. I hope you like the session. We majorly focused on the current context and some historical context, but to summarize, there have been three major wars between Pakistan and India, and the relationship have been strained over the decades. There have been some good moments as well. There have been good periods where we call a term called cricket diplomacy, where some moments of the leadership would come together in a cricket match and talk about something that can benefit both countries economically and diplomatically. There have also been an attempt called Aman Ki Asha between the two countries, trying to bring together the neighbors, because there's a lot of things that we can talk about. Another important thing is about the similarity of culture, then the similarity of language, because we can understand each other's, particularly Urdu and Hindi are pretty much the same. It's written differently, but it's understandable, and that's why the art industry, particularly films and arts and songs, are equally popular in both sides of the country. Both countries like to watch it. India has a very big cinema industry, which obviously remained popular in Pakistan in the 80s and 90s. Slowly it has declined in Pakistan a bit, but because of the emergence of private TV channels in Pakistan. But circumstances were there that both countries used to be influenced by their culture. They used to praise the artists like Pakistan. Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan has a huge fan following in India, and similarly other artists who have made big names in India as well. So yes, there have been art exchange, there have been efforts, but the ground reality is that relationship between the two countries have been strained for a long period of time, and it's time to look into it from a critical perspective. And it seems probably that the relationship will further go towards some seriousness, and one needs to look at it from a critical perspective. So the questions now we have: how do you see Pakistan-India relations? Do you think that there should be a trade increase between Pakistan and India? What are the real changes for diplomatic relations between Indian? What are the real challenges between the Pakistan and India relationship that we can talk about? And obviously, these are some of the references that we've used. And I hope that the session, the detailed session that you just saw, was fruitful. You may have had some good points. You have some new questions, so you can put that in. We'll be talking more about it. I hope you enjoyed the session. So we'll be in touch. Thank you very much for being here. See you next time. Goodbye.